What are 3 lies you have been told since childhood? Let's start with the first lie and proceed from there. The first obvious lie, to so call it, that perhaps all in the current kind of intellectual milieu, meaning culture, implicitly or explicitly believe is that I am my brain, or at best I am resultant from my brain. Let's give 3 arguments against that seem to be decisive in order of ease of understanding, meaning something very obvious and then a little bit more subtle and a little bit more subtle. A very obvious objection to that is that there are conditions, for instance, such as are called hydrocephalus, where a person loses essentially their whole brain. We can say their whole brain, a little bit of tissue can remain at the top of the skull, for example, but upwards of 90-95% of brain tissue can be lost. And in some cases that does lead to some problems, but in other cases it does not. And there have been recorded, well-documented cases of individuals living functional lives, going to work, in at least one recorded instance, graduating college, having a 130, if memory serves, IQ, and yet having essentially no brain. Neuroplasticity, quote unquote, can be cited to some extent, right? Get rid of half a hemisphere, okay, but to this extent, it does not seem to explain this phenomenon. 2, the conventional view is that I think with or because of the motions of my neurons, or that which the neurons are composed of, and that is what leads to my thoughts. Let's take an example of thought. Let's say that I want to figure out what 1 + 1 is. The answer that I hopefully will get to, which is 2, is that predicated on, or can it be predicated on, the motions of particles or the modifications of organic tissue? No. Those modifications can be used to get to the answer, but it's the answer which determines itself, if I solve the equation correctly, that is. Meaning 1 and 1 make 2, not because of anything in here or any chemicals or any hormones, but because it is objectively so. And if I follow that out using my cognitive capacities, then I will attain to reality as it really is, as opposed to something subjective, and that is a phenomenon of my particular anatomy. So we see that real thinking is objective. Real thinking puts us in contact with reality as it really is, as opposed to being simply some kind of strictly idiosyncratic function, which would not be possible should the brain be me, and should I have no possible means of attaining to reality with simply an organ in my head. So that's a little bit more subtle argument. We can step it up an even more subtle argument, which can be difficult to grasp, but we can try, is that any and all content such as occurs in experience can only be thought of in the same fundamental way. To use a technical philosophical term, it can only exist to us on the same epistemic footing, meaning as it concerns knowledge. So for example, I can see a stone, I can see a cloud, and also I can see something in an MRI machine, perhaps, if my head is scanned. Hopefully that's about it as it concerns my brain, but I can see other brains, perhaps as a brain surgeon, or in the case of a cadaver. So, however, whatever it is that I see, whatever it is that I touch, whatever it is that I experience, it all comes across to subjectivity, or to a first-person point of view, such as is not itself that content. Therefore, to apply strict and formal causation onto some segment of our experience, such as we call our brain, is not logically permissible. It's not a step that can actually be done. Again, that is a subtle argument, but we have the other easier arguments as well. All of these arguments lead us to the conclusion that I, in the capacity at least of subjectivity, and in the capacity of the possibility of objective thought and self-active intelligence, cannot possibly be synonymous with a bodily organ in between my ears, even if that bodily organ is a helpful or necessary condition for the function of my intelligence. Meaning, it may be necessary to have chocolate chips in order to have chocolate chip cookies, but that is not a sufficient condition. And just because you withdraw, when you withdraw those chocolate chips, you cannot have chocolate chip cookies, still does not make it a sufficient condition. It may be necessary, although in light of the first class of examples, such as people functioning without brains essentially, that's not even certain. But let's say it's necessary to have at least some brain in order to think. That does not make it a sufficient condition. That cannot give us permission to apply formal causation onto the brain as it concerns sentience itself and as it concerns intelligence itself. So that is one major quote-unquote lie or misconception that virtually all in the modern day implicitly or explicitly believe. Number two, physics can give us insight as to reality. What is reality? Well, it's a bunch of particles, it's a bunch of atoms, and the way to really understand what reality is by studying physics, right, and listening to what physicists and maybe astrophysicists and such have to say, right? There's some kind of bottom reality, which is constituted out of who knows what. Nowadays, there's all kinds of fancy terms, right? The Higgs boson, the quantum, the this and the that. That's really what reality is. And then other things that we consider to be reality, that may or may not be real. At best, it's kind of an epiphenomenon of that base reality. It kind of comes about as it happens. Who knows? It's concepts, it's conceptual, it's just ideas, it's just out of our brain, right? Per the prior point. This, however, is not so. And it can be shown to be not so. Briefly, how is that entire kind of conception, the gist of that conception, how can that ever have arisen in the first place? Right, so a step that has been taken was to separate our experience, to split it into so-called primary and secondary qualities. Primary qualities being, say, extension, visible extension, tangible extension, shape, number, right, perhaps some others, or just those. And then secondary qualities being color, taste, appearance, and such. Now, the given worldview that is in question holds that secondary qualities are mental, right? The color is just in my mind, and what's really out there are these things in themselves, right, that are just there to and for themselves in terms of primary qualities. Why is this false? Well, because what we have is, again, per the prior point, experience, and that's about it. Experience comes to us with both its secondary and its primary qualities, or its primary and, there we go, its secondary qualities. I see a red apple. I see a blue cloud. To then suppose that there's an actual hard split somewhere, that the apple is objective in the capacity of the fact that I can't close my hand around it, or I can crush it, but let's say not. But it's subjective in terms of its color. That's a purely arbitrary, voluntary step, which we can't take for purposes of convenience, because more people might agree that they can't move their hand through a wall than they would agree as to color. It's easier to communicate, but all the same, it is arbitrary, it is voluntary. Now, physics goes off of a certain sort of skeleton based on these primary qualities and their measurements, and then extrapolates using math from there until various terms are reached, such as the atoms, such as the electrons, the Higgs boson, the this and the that. It is purely verbal, conceptual, mathematical. What we have and what we cannot get around are our experiences as they are given to us in a brute sort of way. Again, to make a long story short, to make it easy to understand, think of a dream. Anything that we can experience in waking life, we can dream. Now imagine a physicist falls asleep and dreams of a different world, right, where things float up and they go sideways, this and that. In order to attain to the world picture that physics attains to, he or she would have to, in the dream, make some measurements, right? Separate those primary qualities. The color is subjective. What's really objective is the length of something, and then I'm going to choose a convention, and I'm going to measure that length, and I'm going to come up with this mathematical, world picture. And then I'm going to start extrapolating using math, using equations from that world picture. And then I'm going to suppose, as the physicist in the dream, that really reality is made up out of these little particles, and maybe that's really what I am. And then they're kind of moving around in my brain to connect those 2 points. And then there's all these things in themselves, and their photons bounce off of them, and then they go into the other particles in here, and then they somehow lead to this world of imagery and smell and color and taste and all of this. Wow. Right? But we see that's a completely illicit step. Right? Everything in the dream exists in the same way. There's nothing that can be done to get around that. There's no experiment that can be done. There's no tool that can be used. Let me build a tunnel under Europe and collide things. Nothing can be done. It's all experience. There's no way to get around that experience. And it's the same thing, obviously, in waking life. Waking life is not a dream, because the term dream refers specifically to a subset of experiences within life at large. If we use the term dream to refer to life, then we just mean by dream what we now mean by life. Life is life and dream is a dream. It's just to highlight the dynamics of knowledge here. Because waking life, epistemically, again, use that term, is identical to dreams. There's nothing different in waking life where we can say, yeah, but in waking life, there are these things in themselves, such that physics allegedly studies and makes claims concerning which. No, it's the same thing. So that's a second misconception. We're visualizing stuff, right? Maybe what we saw in the physics textbook, which even, to be honest, within the closed paradigm of physics in the last century, early in the last century, in the 1900s, that whole notion has been picked apart. But that might be what we're doing. We're visualizing these little particles, and we're thinking this is the reality, where we're visualizing different kind of images commensurate to terms like stars and supernovas and, you know, the universe. That's really what there is. And here I am, this little speck, right? This little dot that is inside my brain and that is somehow perceiving this amazing world. The correct view seems to be everything is it's reality, right? It's experience. Just use that word to unify everything that we have, including my senses, including my body, including the phenomena that I experience. And physics most certainly cannot give us any genuine philosophical insight as to the nature of reality. Lastly, and most importantly, arguably the third lie that we quite possibly believe is that we are just fine the way that we are. Essentially, I'm good. Right? The problem is that you're not the way that you're supposed to be, or the world is not the way that it's supposed to be. Something is off politically, something is off environmentally, something is off somewhere else. But me, I'm essentially good. Now, to, so to say, steelman that point of view, meaning to first strengthen it, it is so that various conditions are helpful and necessary to live a happy and wholesome human life. Those conditions include, excuse me, things like oxygen, things like food, things like water, things like shelter, things like bodily homeostasis, not being too hot, not being too cold, and they can include endless other things like cell phones, things like GPSs, things like healthy economies and good political systems, no doubt, no problem. But when all is said and done, right, when all the helpful and necessary conditions have been satisfied, if the one sufficient condition for human wholesomeness and happiness is not satisfied, I will not be good. I will not be wholesome and happy. What is that sufficient condition? Essentially, to put it very broadly, I have to substantially change. I have to substantially mature in order to grow into humanhood, to grow into personhood. Right now, I'm like a baby, which is great. It's fine. It's beautiful. But I do need to grow. I need to grow morally. I need to grow mentally. I need to overstep my selfishness and my self-centeredness. Now, as to that, we see that the first two lies, or the first two misconceptions, excuse me, can be quite problematic. Because if I believe that I am synonymous with an organ in my head, right, or perhaps at best, again, an epiphenomenon of it, if I believe that the real reality is the quote-unquote universe, or little particles, or whatever the particles are made of, I have no real motivation. And there's really no room in that worldview for me to substantially work on myself in an ethical way. Then I work on myself in the gym and with diet and lifestyle is great, but in an ethical way, meaning overcoming my selfishness, overcoming my self-centeredness, overcoming my, my self-idolatry, coming to right terms with myself and with others, becoming a loving, giving, truly good person. There's no room for that in a worldview where I'm just a brain in a universe. Why would I do any of that? That's ridiculous. I'm just a thing. Perhaps I can still feel pleasure and pain, but so what? Then I can pursue some pleasure and avoid some pain. At best, have some practical hedonism, right? I'm going to sacrifice a little bit of pleasure in order to gain some kind of longer-term pleasure. But it's all not serious. It's all nonsense, comparatively speaking. Ultimately, I can become cognizant of the first two lies, and then attain to an awareness of the necessity of substantial ethical change. I'm not good the way that I am in the state of nature as just a human animal. I need to become a human being to myself, for myself. In the human rights sense, we're all human beings to ourselves and for ourselves. And that takes, substantial effort and desire. But hopefully, if we can become aware of these misconceptions, that can go a long ways in that good direction. Thank you for listening.